The musty storage facility on Highway 9 reeked of old secrets and forgotten dreams. Sarah Martinez clutched her winning bid number as she approached Unit 47, hoping the circus memorabilia inside would fetch enough to keep the lights on for another month. As a single mother barely surviving on her teacher's salary, every dollar counted since David's mysterious death 2 years ago. But when she pried open the first weathered crate marked Bellecourt Brothers Traveling Circus, 1987, Sarah's blood turned to ice. Inside wasn't vintage carnival equipment. It was something that defied explanation, something that moved, something that whispered her dead husband's name in the darkness. The police had told her David died in a car accident, but the evidence before her painted a very different picture. A picture that suggested David hadn't been the insurance adjuster she'd married, but something far more dangerous. As Sarah stared into the crate, one question burned through her mind. If David had been keeping these things hidden, what else had he lied about? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The thing in the crate shifted again, and Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The storage unit's fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows across the maze of wooden boxes that filled the space from floor to ceiling. Each crate bore the same faded logo, a grotesque clown face with eyes that seemed to follow her movement. She fumbled for her phone, finger hovering over 911, but stopped. What would she tell them? That she'd found something unexplainable in a storage unit? That her dead husband's name was being whispered by whatever lurked inside? They'd think she'd finally cracked under the pressure of single motherhood and grief. A soft scratching sound emanated from the crate, followed by what sounded distinctly like breathing. Sarah's rational mind raced through possibilities. Maybe a possum had gotten trapped inside, or rats had made a nest. But possums didn't whisper names, rats didn't make sounds that resembled human speech. Taking a shaky breath, she forced herself to step closer. The crate was roughly the size of a coffin, with brass hinges green with age and a heavy padlock that hung open, as if someone had recently been inside. The wood was scarred and stained, with deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks. "David?" she whispered, feeling foolish the moment the word left her lips. The scratching stopped abruptly. Then, so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, came a voice. "Sarah, help me." Her legs gave out, and she crashed to her knees on the concrete floor. That voice, she'd know it anywhere. It was David's voice, the same gentle tone that used to read bedtime stories to Emma, the same voice that had whispered, "I love you" on their wedding night. But David was dead. She'd seen his mangled car, attended his funeral, watched them lower his casket into the ground. With trembling hands, she pushed the crate lid open wider. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the storage facility like a wounded animal. Inside, nestled in moldy straw and what looked like old circus costumes, was something that made her stomach lurch. It wasn't David. It wasn't even human. The creature was small, perhaps the size of a house cat, with pale, translucent skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were clouded white, blind, but somehow still aware of her presence. Most disturbing were its hands, delicate, almost human, with long fingers that ended in sharp points. Around its neck hung a small locket, tarnished silver that Sarah recognized immediately. She'd given David that locket on their first anniversary. Inside was a photo of them at the county fair, laughing as they shared cotton candy. He'd worn it every day until his death, and she'd assumed it had been buried with him. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and David's voice emerged once again. "Sarah, they took me. They changed me. Run." She scrambled backward, knocking over a smaller crate. Its lid popped open, spilling out yellowed papers and photographs. Even in her panic, something caught her eye, a newspaper clipping with a headline that made her blood freeze. "Insurance investigator David Martinez dies investigating Bellecourt Circus fire claims." But David had told her he was investigating a simple car accident that week. He'd never mentioned any circus, any fire. Another lie. How many more were there? The creature in the crate began to keen, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. The sound was answered by similar cries from other crates around the unit, a chorus of inhuman voices that filled the small space with their anguish. Sarah grabbed the newspaper clipping and ran, not stopping until she reached her car in the parking lot. Her hands shook so violently she could barely get the key in the ignition. As she peeled out of the storage facility, one thought consumed her mind. Those things knew David. They had his voice, his memories, his locket, and they were waiting for something. The scratching sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood from the inside. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the largest crate, its faded red paint peeling away to reveal rotting timber beneath. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the hollow echo of her heartbeat in the cramped storage unit. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to drop the crowbar, slam the metal door shut and pretend she'd never won lot 247. But something kept her frozen in place. A morbid curiosity that had been her weakness since childhood, the same trait that had driven her to become an investigative journalist before her world collapsed 18 months ago. The silence stretched until she began to wonder if she'd imagined the whole thing. Stress could do that, couldn't it? Make you hear things that weren't there? God knew she'd been under enough pressure lately, with the medical bills piling up and her savings account bleeding dry. She took a tentative step closer to the crate. The wood was older than she'd initially thought, the craftsmanship speaking of a bygone era when things were built to last. Brass hinges had turned green with age, and strange symbols were carved along the edges, not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something that made her skin crawl when she looked at them too long. A piece of yellowed paper was tucked beneath a loose slat. Sarah worked it free with trembling fingers, careful not to tear the brittle material. The letterhead made her stomach lurch. Blackwood and Associates Circus, established 1962. Below that, in spidery handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar, someone had written, "Specimen acquired, transport arranged, payment pending." The signature at the bottom made the world tilt sideways. Marcus Chen. Her husband's name, written in his distinctive scrawl. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto the dusty concrete floor, the paper fluttering from her numb fingers. Marcus had been a pediatrician, gentle and methodical, who spent his free time tending their herb garden and reading medical journals. The idea of him having any connection to some seedy traveling circus was absurd. But there was his signature, bold as life, on what looked like some kind of invoice or receipt. The scratching started again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a low sound that might have been whimpering. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her journalist instincts overriding her fear. If Marcus had been involved in something, she needed to know. She owed him that much, even if he'd lied to her about everything else. The crowbar felt heavier now as she wedged it beneath the crate's lid. The brass hinges protested with a shriek that echoed off the metal walls. Whatever was inside responded immediately, throwing itself against the confines with enough force to make the entire crate rock. Sarah jerked backward, nearly dropping her only weapon. The smell hit her like a physical blow, not the expected mustiness of decay, but something alive and organic. Wet fur and something else, something that reminded her of the reptile house at the zoo, but wrong somehow. Like the scent had been filtered through a fever dream. She forced herself to lean forward and peer through the gap she'd created. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and what looked like old straw. Then something pale moved in the darkness, too quick and too smooth to be human. A face emerged from the gloom, or what might have been a face if faces were supposed to bend that way. The features were almost human, almost familiar, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in funhouse mirrors. The eyes that met hers were startlingly blue, the same shade as Marcus's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with such love and concern during her long recovery. The thing in the crate opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's jaw, not in anything that had once been human. When it spoke, the voice was a perfect mimicry of her dead husband's gentle tenor. "Sarah," it whispered, and the sound of her name in that beloved voice made her soul recoil. "I've been waiting for you." She stumbled backward, the crowbar clattering to the ground as she fought the urge to vomit. The creature pressed its malformed face against the gap, trying to squeeze through the opening she'd created. Its movements were wrong, boneless in places where bones should be, rigid where flesh should yield. "Don't you want to know what happened to me?" It continued in Marcus's voice, each word a fresh wound. "Don't you want to know where I really went that night?" Sarah's back hit the metal door of the storage unit, the cold surface shocking her into action. She fumbled for the handle, her hands slick with sweat, but stopped when she heard another sound from deeper in the shadows behind the crate. More scratching, more whimpering. There wasn't just one crate, there were dozens. The brass padlock on the first crate was green with age, but it snapped easily under the bolt cutters Sarah had borrowed from her neighbor. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid, the hinges protesting with a shriek that echoed through the storage unit like a wounded animal. Inside, nestled in yellowed straw and moth-eaten velvet, lay an assortment of carnival memorabilia that made her stomach lurch. Faded photographs showed grinning performers in elaborate costumes, their painted faces grotesque in the harsh flash photography of decades past. A leather-bound ledger contained meticulous records written in spidery handwriting, documenting ticket sales, performer contracts, and something called feeding schedules that made no sense in the context of a traveling circus. But it was the smell that made her step back, a cloying sweetness mixed with something metallic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The odor seemed to pulse from the crate itself, growing stronger each time she leaned closer. Sarah picked up one of the photographs, her pulse quickening as she studied the faces. There, in the background behind a group of acrobats, stood a man whose profile looked disturbingly familiar. The image was grainy and the lighting poor, but something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head. "No," she whispered. But her hands were already searching through the other pictures, desperate to prove herself wrong. The second photograph made her legs weak. James stood clear as day beside a painted wagon, wearing clothes she'd never seen before, an old-fashioned suit with a vest and pocket watch. But that wasn't what made her sink onto the concrete floor of the storage unit. It was the date stamped on the back, 1952. Her husband would have been negative 30 years old in 1952. Sarah's rational mind scrambled for explanations. A grandfather, maybe? A great-uncle? James had always been vague about his family history, claiming his parents died when he was young and that he had no other relatives. She'd found it romantic at the time, the mysterious man with no past who chose to build a future with her. Now it felt sinister. The third crate fought her, its lock more complex than the others. When it finally opened, Sarah immediately wished it hadn't. Inside, arranged in neat rows like surgical instruments, lay an array of metal contraints, shackles, chains, what looked like a muzzle designed for something larger than a dog. Everything was stained with dark patches that had never quite washed clean. A manila envelope tucked beneath the restraints contained more photographs, but these made her stomach turn. They showed cage-like structures with bars thick enough to contain something powerful and dangerous. In several images, those cages weren't empty. Sarah squinted at the blurry shapes behind the bars, unable to quite make out what she was looking at. The forms seemed almost human, but wrong somehow, too tall, proportioned incorrectly, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. In one particularly disturbing photo, glowing eyes reflected the camera's flash from within the shadows of a cage. She was so absorbed in the horrifying images that she almost missed the sound from the corner of the storage unit. A soft scratching, like fingernails against wood. Sarah's head snapped up, photographs scattering to the floor. The sound came again, definitely from the direction of the largest crate, the one she hadn't opened yet. This one was different from the others, more heavily constructed with metal reinforcements and what appeared to be air holes drilled in precise patterns along the sides. The scratching became more insistent, accompanied by what might have been breathing or whimpering. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to slam the storage unit door and never look back. But she found herself moving toward the sound instead, drawn by a horrible fascination and the growing certainty that whatever was in that crate held the answers to questions she was afraid to ask. The lock on this crate was newer than the others, a modern combination padlock that shouldn't have been difficult to cut, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the bolt cutters steady. The scratching grew more frantic as she worked, as if whatever was inside could sense her proximity. When the lock finally gave way, Sarah hesitated with her hands on the lid. Once she opened this, there would be no going back to her simple life of wondering what had happened to James. Whatever was inside this box would change everything. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt suffocating. Sarah lifted the lid. Inside, curled in a nest of stained blankets and surrounded by empty food containers, was something that had once been human. It raised its head at the sudden influx of light, and Sarah found herself staring into eyes she recognized, eyes that belonged to her missing husband. But the rest of James was wrong in ways that made her mind refuse to process what she was seeing. The metallic screech that had emerged from the crate still echoed in Sarah's mind as she sat in her car outside the storage facility, hands trembling on the steering wheel. She'd fled the unit so fast she'd left the overhead light burning, the door wide open. Now, 20 minutes later, she was trying to convince herself she'd imagined the whole thing. But the scratches on her forearm said otherwise. 3 parallel lines where something sharp had grazed her skin as she'd stumbled backward in terror. They weren't deep, barely bleeding, but they were real. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Jenny. "How's the storage unit treasure hunt going? Find anything good?" Sarah stared at the message, unsure how to respond. "Found my dead husband's belongings and something that might have killed him." She deleted the draft and typed back, still sorting through everything. "Call you later." She forced herself to walk back to the unit. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the circus crates. The opened one sat silent now, its brass latches gleaming. Whatever had made that sound was either gone or waiting. Sarah approached slowly, her phone's flashlight app ready. The wooden planks of the crate's lid bore deep gouges on the inside surface, scratch marks that looked fresh, despite the vintage appearance of the container. She peered into the straw-lined interior, noting how it had been disturbed, as if something had burrowed through it. At the bottom, partially hidden beneath the remaining straw, lay a leather journal. Sarah recognized it immediately. Michael's handwriting on the cover, his name embossed in fading gold letters. Her breath caught. She'd searched their house for months after his disappearance, desperate for any clue about where he'd gone. The police had found nothing. Yet here was his journal, hidden in a storage unit she'd never known existed. With shaking fingers, she lifted the journal from the crate. The leather was worn smooth, darkened with age and what looked like water stains. She opened to a random page. Day 127. The feeding schedule is critical. Dr. Arnott was right about the protein requirements, but he underestimated their intelligence. They're learning, adapting. The smaller ones especially. They watch me now with something that almost looks like recognition. Sarah's blood ran cold. Michael had been a software engineer, working from home on database systems for small businesses. He'd never mentioned any Dr. Arnott, never talked about feeding schedules or protein requirements. This handwriting was definitely his, but the content felt like it belonged to a stranger. She flipped to an earlier entry. Day 45. Successfully transported 3 specimens from the Meridian site. The Circus connection was genius. Who questions vintage carnival equipment? The crates are perfect. temperature-controlled, ventilated, and most importantly, they contain the electromagnetic field that keeps them docile during transport. Meridian. Sarah knew that name. It was a pharmaceutical company about 40 miles outside town that had closed suddenly 2 years ago amid rumors of ethical violations. Michael had driven past it sometimes on his way to client meetings, but he'd never mentioned working there. She continued reading, each entry more disturbing than the last. References to breeding pairs, behavioral modifications, and containment protocols. Michael wrote about something called Project Carousel with the enthusiasm of a man obsessed. The final entry was dated 3 days before his disappearance. Day 203, they've broken free of the primary containment. Lost 2 specimens, but I've managed to secure the breeding pair in transport crates 7 and 8. Dr. Arnott says to destroy them, but I can't. Not after everything we've learned. I'm moving them to the storage facility tonight. Sarah can never know. If something happens to me, the key is hidden in the garden gnome by the roses. The truth about what we created needs to survive, even if I don't. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the journal. The garden gnome by the roses, she'd moved it when she'd replanted the flower bed last spring, had found a small brass key taped underneath and thrown it away, assuming it was for some forgotten padlock. A soft, chittering sound came from behind her. She spun around, heart hammering. The noise seemed to come from one of the other crates, the larger one stacked against the far wall. As she watched, frozen in terror, something moved across the gap between 2 containers, a flash of pale, segmented flesh that disappeared too quickly to focus on. The journal slipped from her numb fingers, pages fluttering as it hit the concrete floor. Michael hadn't disappeared. He hadn't run away or suffered some tragic accident. He'd been taken by whatever was in these crates, whatever he'd helped create, and now she was alone with them. Another sound echoed through the unit, a wet, sliding noise like something large moving across glass. It was coming from multiple directions now, as if the creatures were surrounding her. Sarah grabbed the journal and backed toward the entrance, but before she could reach safety, the overhead light flickered and died, plunging the storage unit into absolute darkness. The thing in the crate had gone silent again, but Sarah couldn't shake the memory of those pale fingers pressing against the wood. She sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, her back against the wall, staring at the collection of circus artifacts that suddenly felt more like evidence than treasure. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Jenny. "How's the storage unit adventure going? Find anything good?" Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. How could she possibly explain this? That she'd found what appeared to be a living creature trapped in a vintage circus crate? That it seemed to recognize her husband's name? Instead, she typed back, still sorting through everything. "We'll call later." The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional metallic ping of the buildings settling. Sarah forced herself to stand, her legs stiff from sitting on the cold floor. She needed to think rationally about this. There had to be an explanation that didn't involve supernatural circus performers locked in wooden boxes. She approached Marcus's old laptop bag, which she'd brought to inventory valuable items for resale. Her hands shook as she opened it and powered up the ancient machine. While it wheezed to life, she examined the other crates more carefully. Each one bore similar brass nameplate holders, though most were empty or tarnished beyond reading. The wood was definitely old. She could smell the decades of must and sawdust embedded in the grain. But it was the construction that caught her attention. These weren't just storage containers, they were built like prison cells. Reinforced corners, metal bands wrapped around the exterior, and on the inside edges she could see now scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had been clawing to get out for a very long time. The laptop finally connected to her phone's hotspot. Sarah pulled up a search engine and typed, "Blackwood Traveling Circus." The results made her stomach drop. The first hit was a newspaper archive from 1987, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague Traveling Circus." She clicked through, her heart hammering as she read about performers who vanished without a trace, investigations that went nowhere, and a circus that operated for decades despite a trail of missing persons reports. Another article, this one from 1992, Blackwood Circus shuttered after owner's death. The accompanying photo showed a grainy black and white image of circus wagons and equipment being auctioned off. In the background, barely visible, were stacks of wooden crates. But it was the third article that made her blood freeze. From 2019, just 6 months before Marcus disappeared, local man investigating vintage circus equipment theft. The local man was Marcus. Sarah's vision blurred as she read her husband's quotes about tracking down stolen circus artifacts, his theory that valuable items from the Blackwood collection had been illegally sold and scattered across the country. He'd been working with insurance companies, trying to locate missing pieces for what he called historical preservation. The Blackwood Circus represents a dark chapter in American entertainment history, Marcus was quoted as saying. These artifacts need to be properly catalogued and studied, not hidden away in private collections. The article mentioned that Marcus had traced several items to storage facilities in the area, that he was close to a breakthrough in his investigation. A soft scratching sound made Sarah look up from the screen. The crate was moving again, just slightly, as if something inside was shifting position. Marcus was looking for you, she whispered to whatever was in there, wasn't he? The scratching stopped. Sarah's mind raced through the timeline. Marcus had started staying late at work, taking mysterious phone calls, disappearing for hours on weekends. She'd thought he was having an affair, but he'd been investigating this circus, tracking down these crates, and then he'd vanished completely, leaving no trace except a vague note about taking care of something important. What if he'd found what he was looking for? What if he'd discovered that the Blackwood Circus artifacts weren't just historical curiosities, but something far more dangerous? The crate creaked, and Sarah heard a sound that made her skin crawl, a low, almost human moan, but with an undertone that suggested vocal cords weren't quite arranged the way they should be. She looked at the brass nameplate again. Elena, the eternal maiden. Whatever Elena was, she'd been in this crate for years, decades possibly, and Marcus had been trying to find her. Sarah closed the laptop and stood up. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Jenny, but she ignored them. She needed answers, and she had a terrible suspicion that the only way to get them was to open that crate and face whatever was inside. But first she needed tools and a plan, and probably a lot more courage than she currently possessed. The scratching began again, more insistent this time, as if Elena somehow knew Sarah was preparing to leave. "I'll be back," Sarah found herself saying to the crate. "I promise." The scratching stopped immediately, as if Elena understood. That was almost the most terrifying thing of all. The basement felt different when Sarah descended the creaky wooden stairs the next morning, coffee mug trembling in her hands. Pale morning light filtered through the single grimy window, casting long shadows across the circus crates that seemed to have multiplied overnight in her exhausted mind. She hadn't slept. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she saw those yellow orbs staring back at her, heard the wet sound of breathing that definitely wasn't human. The logical part of her brain insisted she'd imagined it all. Stress, grief, and financial desperation creating hallucinations. But the scratches on the inside of the crate were real. The smell was real. Sarah approached the center crate slowly, noting that the metal clasps she'd carefully repositioned last night were now slightly askew. Her pulse quickened. Either someone had been in her basement, or something had been trying to get out. The brass nameplate caught the morning light. Madame Zelda's Traveling Circus of Wonders, St. 1952. She ran her finger over the engraved letters, feeling the worn grooves. Beneath the circus name in smaller script were the words "Property of H. Blackwood, Master of Ceremonies." H. Blackwood. The name sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the basement's dampness. Sarah pulled out her phone and searched for information about the circus. The results were sparse. A.U. newspaper clippings from the 1950s and 60s, mostly about mysterious disappearances in towns where the circus had performed. One article from 1964 made her blood run cold. Local man vanishes during circus performance. Harold Blackwood under investigation. The grainy photograph accompanying the article showed a tall, gaunt man in a ringmaster's coat. His eyes were pale and unsettling, but it was the smile that made Sarah's hands shake. She'd seen that smile before, in her husband David's photos from his last business trip, the trip he'd never returned from. A soft scraping sound from behind made her spin around. The leftmost crate, the one she hadn't opened, was rocking slightly. The movement was rhythmic, deliberate, like something inside was testing the boundaries of its prison. Sarah backed toward the stairs, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. David had always teased her about it, calling her dangerously inquisitive. The memory of his voice gave her courage. She approached the moving crate and placed her ear against the wood. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was inside knew she was listening. Then came a sound that made her stumble backward, a low, almost human moan, followed by what sounded distinctly like sobbing. "Hello?" Sarah whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. The sobbing intensified, and underneath it, she heard something that made her heart nearly stop. A voice, muffled and distorted, but unmistakably forming words. "Sarah, help me." Her coffee mug shattered on the concrete floor. The voice, it was David's voice. With shaking hands, she fumbled with the crate's clasps. They were stiff with age and rust, but desperation gave her strength. The lid creaked open, and the smell that escaped was overwhelming. Decay, fear, and something else. Something wild. Inside the crate was darkness deeper than should have been possible. Sarah grabbed her phone's flashlight and aimed it into the void. What she saw would haunt her forever. It was David, but not David. His face was there, recognizable despite being gaunt and pale, but his body was wrong. Elongated limbs ended in claws that had scratched the wood raw. His eyes, once warm brown, now held that same yellow glow she'd seen the night before. When he saw her, his mouth opened in what might have been relief or hunger, revealing teeth that were definitely not human. "Sarah," he whispered, and his voice carried harmonics that hurt her ears. "I've been waiting. I've been so hungry." She wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to wake up from this nightmare. Instead, she reached toward him, maternal instinct overriding terror. "David, what happened to you? How are you here?" His clawed hand shot out faster than her eye could follow, gripping her wrist with inhuman strength. Where he touched her, her skin began to burn and change, taking on a grayish pallor. "The circus found me," David said, his voice becoming less human with each word. "Blackwood found me. He showed me wonders, Sarah. Beautiful, terrible wonders. And now you get to see them too." The other crates began to rock and shake. Clasps popped open with metallic clangs that echoed through the basement like gunshots. Sarah tried to pull away, but David's grip was iron, and something was happening to her arm, spreading up toward her shoulder. "Don't fight it," David crooned, his face shifting between the man she'd loved and something altogether alien. "You'll love what you become. We can be together forever now, just like Blackwood promised." The basement filled with sounds of wood splintering and things that should not exist drawing their first free breaths in decades. The basement felt different now, charged with an energy that made Sarah's skin crawl. She stood at the top of the stairs, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other, staring down into the darkness where those circus crates waited. The thing inside had gone silent again after its violent outburst, but she could feel its presence, like a weight pressing against her chest. She descended slowly, each step echoing in the confined space. The beam of her flashlight swept across the damaged crate, revealing fresh gouges in the wood where whatever was inside had clawed at its prison. Splinters littered the concrete floor, and she noticed something else, a dark stain seeping from beneath the crate that definitely hadn't been there before. Sarah approached the undamaged crate first, the one with Marcus's name carved into its side. Her hands trembled as she positioned the crowbar under the lid. The nails groaned in protest as she applied pressure, but this time she was ready for resistance. With a sharp crack, the wood split. Inside, wrapped in yellowed canvas, she found a leather journal bound with string. The cover was embossed with faded gold lettering. Castellano Brothers Traveling Circus, 1952. Her heart hammered as she opened it, recognizing Marcus's handwriting immediately. June 15th. I've found it. After 3 years of following dead-end leads and chasing ghost stories, I've finally tracked down what's left of the Castellano collection. The locals won't talk about what happened that night in 1952, but the police reports tell enough of the story. 7 dead, dozens injured, and something that wasn't quite human escaped into the woods. Sarah's mouth went dry. She flipped through more pages, Marcus's neat script documenting months of research. August 3rd, the thing they called Il Diavolo della Fame, the Hunger Devil. Giuseppe Castellano claimed he found it in the Romanian mountains, but I think it found him. The newspaper accounts describe it as a circus act gone wrong, but the witness statements paint a different picture. This wasn't a performance. It was feeding time. A low scraping sound came from the damaged crate, and Sarah's flashlight beam snapped toward it. The wood was bowing outward now, and she could see something pale pressing against the gaps between the slats. She forced herself to keep reading. October 12th. I know Sarah thinks I'm becoming obsessed, but she doesn't understand. This thing killed innocent people, children, and it's still out there. The authorities covered it up, called it a gas leak explosion. But I've talked to survivors. They remember the teeth. They remember the screaming. "Marcus," she whispered to the empty basement. "What did you do?" December 1st, I've made contact with Victor Kowalski, one of the last surviving circus hands. He's agreed to meet me in Portland, says he knows where they buried the evidence. The creatures, plural. Dear God, there was more than one. The scraping grew louder, more frantic. Sarah glanced up to see the damaged crate rocking back and forth. Whatever was inside was getting stronger or more desperate. She turned the page with shaking fingers. February 8th. Victor showed me the warehouse where they stored everything. The local authorities just wanted it gone, so they paid some company to lock it all away. Crates, costumes, equipment, and the holding cells. Sarah, if something happens to me, if I don't come back, you need to know. I couldn't just walk away. Not after seeing what these things can do. Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. The final entry was dated just a week before Marcus disappeared. February 14th. Tomorrow I go in. Victor has the keys, the location of every cage. He says some of them might still be occupied. I've left detailed notes hidden in my workshop. If I'm right about what these creatures are, fire won't kill them, but it will slow them down. The Romanian legends speak of feeding them back to the darkness they came from. I pray I never have to find out what that means. A thunderous crash made Sarah jump. The damaged crate had split completely down one side, and something was pushing through the gap. She caught a glimpse of elongated fingers ending in black claws, skin the color of old parchment stretched too tight over bone. She slammed the journal shut and backed toward the stairs. The thing in the crate let out a sound between a hiss and a purr, almost conversational. It was trying to communicate. "Stay back," she commanded, raising the crowbar. "I mean it." The fingers withdrew slightly, and she heard what sounded impossibly like laughter. Soft, wet, utterly inhuman laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah ran for the stairs, clutching Marcus's journal to her chest. Behind her, she could hear wood splintering as something that should have been dead for 70 years finally broke free of its cage. She reached the basement door and slammed it shut, turning the deadbolt with fumbling fingers. The laughter followed her up from the darkness below, patient and hungry. The basement reeked of mildew and something far worse, a sweet, cloying stench that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Detective Morrison played his flashlight beam across the concrete walls, revealing water stains that looked disturbingly like rust-colored handprints. "Jesus," he muttered, covering his nose with his sleeve. How long has this place been sealed up? Sarah couldn't answer. Her throat had gone dry the moment they'd descended the rickety wooden steps. The basement stretched further back than the house's footprint should have allowed, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow Morrison's flashlight beam. "There," she whispered, pointing to the far corner where something glinted in the darkness. They moved forward carefully, their footsteps echoing off the low ceiling. The floor was littered with old circus equipment, rusted chains, mouldering canvas and wooden crates marked with faded foreign text. But it was what hung from the ceiling that made Morrison stop dead in his tracks. Dozens of photographs dangled from fishing line like macabre ornaments, slowly rotating in the stagnant air. Sarah's breath caught as the flashlight illuminated face after face, all women, all brunette, all bearing an unsettling resemblance to herself. "Christ almighty," Morrison breathed, raising his light higher. "There must be 50 of them." Sarah stepped closer to one photograph, her hand trembling as she reached toward it. The woman in the picture was laughing, unaware she was being watched. The shot had been taken through what looked like a window, candid, invasive, predatory. "Detective!" Her voice cracked. "Look at the dates!" Morrison moved the beam to illuminate the small white numbers in the corner of each photo. 1987, 1993, 2001, 2008. The dates went back decades, but they weren't random. There was a pattern, roughly every 6 to 7 years. "He's been doing this for a long time," Morrison said grimly. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. The woman in the storage unit. She wasn't the first, and she wasn't the last. Morrison's flashlight found a workbench against the back wall, its surface covered with tools that belonged in a veterinarian's office rather than a basement. Syringes, bottles of clear liquid, and something that looked disturbingly like a cattle prod. But it was the journal lying open beside them that made Sarah's blood run cold. Page after page of meticulous notes written in a cramped, familiar handwriting. Subject 12. Acquired October 15, 2019. Initial conditioning proceeding as planned. Reduced vocal responses to punishment stimuli. Note: increase calcium supplements. Bone density concerning after prolonged confinement. Morrison read aloud, his voice growing quieter with each horrific detail. Sarah found herself backing away from the workbench, her mind reeling. 2019, she whispered. That's when David started working late, when he said he was expanding the business. The detective flipped through more pages, his expression growing darker. "Sarah, you need to see this." She forced herself to look at the journal entry he indicated. The date was from just 3 months ago. Subject 13. New acquisition shows promising traits. Physical specifications match optimal parameters. Begin preliminary surveillance phase. Target: Sarah Michelle Chen, 34, employed at Henderson Elementary. Lives alone following recent divorce. Ideal candidate for extended conditioning protocol. The world tilted sideways. Sarah grabbed the workbench for support, her vision swimming. That's me. He was watching me." "There's more." Morrison's voice was barely audible. "Says here you weren't random. Says you were replacement acquisition after Subject 12's unfortunate deterioration." The implications hit her like a physical blow. The woman in the storage unit, she had been meant to be Sarah's predecessor, and when she died, Sarah had unknowingly become the next target. "But how did he know I'd bid on that storage unit?" she asked desperately. "How could he have planned—" She stopped, remembering. The auctioneer had seemed surprised when she'd shown up, had mentioned that someone had specifically requested she be notified about the sale. Someone had wanted her to find that unit. It was bait, she realized, her voice hollow. The whole thing was bait to draw me in. Morrison was still reading, his flashlight revealing more and more disturbing details. Blueprints for something called a conditioning chamber, medical charts tracking the deterioration of previous subjects, and most chilling of all, a detailed floor plan of Sarah's apartment with notes about her daily routine, her work schedule, even her sleeping patterns. A sound from upstairs made them both freeze, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on old floorboards. Morrison immediately drew his weapon, motioning for Sarah to get behind him. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, as if their owner was in no hurry. "Police!" Morrison called out. "Building is surrounded." The footsteps stopped. In the suffocating silence that followed, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Whoever was upstairs knew they were down here, had probably been watching them from the moment they'd entered the house. The basement suddenly felt less like a crime scene and more like a trap. The thing in the crate had stopped moving. Sarah pressed her ear against the wooden slats, straining to hear any sound from within. The silence was somehow worse than the scratching and chittering that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights. She'd managed to reinforce the lock with a heavy chain and padlock, but doubt gnawed at her. What if it had found another way out? Her phone buzzed against the workbench. Another missed call from Detective Morrison. He'd been persistent since their meeting at the diner, leaving increasingly urgent voicemails about Marcus's case being reopened. Sarah deleted the notification without listening to the message. She couldn't deal with police questions when she was barely holding herself together. The storage unit felt smaller each day, the circus crates seeming to multiply in the dim fluorescent light. She'd counted them obsessively, 13 total, but sometimes she could swear there were more lurking in the shadows behind the larger pieces. The ornate trunk she'd initially dismissed now drew her attention. Its brass fittings had developed a green patina that hadn't been there before, and strange symbols were etched into its leather surface. Symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Sarah approached the trunk cautiously. The air around it felt thick, almost syrupy, and carried a sweet, cloying scent that reminded her of overripe fruit and old incense. Her fingers traced the intricate lock mechanism, surprised when it clicked open at her touch. Inside, nested in faded red velvet, lay a collection of yellowed photographs and documents. The top image made her stomach lurch, a carnival poster featuring Dr. Erasmus Blackwood's traveling menagerie of wonders. The illustration showed a tall, gaunt man in a top hat, surrounded by cages containing shadowy figures that were disturbingly human-like, yet wrong in ways her mind struggled to process. Beneath the poster, she found performance programs dating back to the 1920s. The acts listed made her skin crawl: The Weeping Woman of Moldavia, Children of the Void, The Hunger That Walks. Each program featured testimonials from audience members describing transformative experiences, spiritual awakenings, and encounters with beings from realms beyond mortal comprehension. A loose photograph caught her attention. A group shot of carnival workers posed in front of the very crates now surrounding her. But it was the figure standing at the edge of the group that made her blood freeze. The face was younger, the hair darker, but the eyes were unmistakable. Marcus stared back at her from a photograph taken nearly a century ago. Sarah's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight, illuminating the photo more clearly. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was definitely Marcus, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But that was impossible. The photograph was clearly vintage, and Marcus would have been born decades after it was taken. More photos revealed the same impossible truth. Marcus appeared in images spanning different decades, sometimes as a performer, sometimes as a spectator, but always present. In a 1943 photograph, he stood beside a woman who looked exactly like Sarah herself, both of them gazing adoringly at one of the ornate crates. The documents beneath the photographs were contracts written in multiple languages, some in alphabets she didn't recognize. The English portions spoke of eternal service, feeding cycles, and the preservation of the bloodline. Names appeared repeatedly throughout the contracts: Blackwood, Morrison, Chen, and stamped at the bottom of nearly every page, M. Henley. Marcus Henley. Her husband's signature, identical to the one she'd seen on their marriage certificate, their mortgage, their insurance policies. A sound from the locked crate made her jump. Not scratching this time, but something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. Low, bubbling, and utterly inhuman. The other crates began to respond, creaking and shifting as if their contents were waking up. Sarah shoved the documents back into the trunk and slammed it shut, but the lock wouldn't catch. The laughter from the crates grew louder, joined by whispers in languages that predated human speech. The fluorescent light overhead began to flicker, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Her phone rang, the sudden normal sound cutting through the supernatural cacophony. Detective Morrison's name flashed on the screen. This time, she answered. "Sarah? Thank God. Listen to me very carefully. Where are you right now?" "The storage unit," she whispered, backing toward the exit as the sounds from the crates intensified. "Get out. Now. Don't take anything with you. Don't look back. There are things about your husband's disappearance that I should have told you sooner." "Morrison," she said, her voice barely audible above the growing chorus from the crates. "What's your first name?" A pause. Why would that matter right now? "Just tell me." "Erasmus," he said quietly. "My name is Erasmus Morrison." The line went dead, and Sarah found herself staring at 13 crates that were no longer locked. The basement of the old Hartley mansion felt like descending into the belly of some ancient beast. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls that wept with decades of moisture. The air tasted of copper and decay, and something else, something that made her stomach turn. "The preservation chamber is through here," Dr. Hartley said, his voice echoing off the walls. His earlier composure had cracked, replaced by something that looked almost like excitement. "My grandfather built it in 1923, after he acquired the Circus collection." Marcus stayed close behind Sarah, his hand resting on her shoulder. She could feel the tension radiating from him, matching her own. The creature, whatever it was, had gone silent in its crate, but she could still feel its presence like a weight in her chest. They passed through a narrow corridor lined with photographs. Sarah's beam caught glimpses of circus performers, their faces painted in grotesque smiles. But it was the other photos that made her pause, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, headlines screaming about disappearances, about the Midnight Circus's final tragic performance. "Here," Dr. Hartley said, stopping before a heavy metal door. "This is where my family kept the specimens alive all these years." The word specimens hit Sarah like a physical blow. "How many are there?" His laugh was hollow. "Fewer now than when my grandfather started. They require feeding." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What kind of feeding?" Instead of answering, Dr. Hartley pulled out an old brass key and unlocked the door. The smell that rushed out was overwhelming, a mixture of formaldehyde, rotting meat, and something else, something alive and feral. The room beyond was larger than Sarah had expected, lined with glass tanks and metal cages. Most were empty now, their contents long dead or transferred elsewhere, but 3 still held occupants. In the first tank, something that might once have been human floated in murky liquid. Its limbs had elongated beyond recognition, and what Sarah had initially taken for hair was actually a mass of writhing tentacles. Its eyes, too many eyes, followed their movement across the room. "The contortionist," Dr. Hartley said matter-of-factly. "She can fit through any space larger than a quarter. My grandfather found her in Budapest in 1924. The second cage held what looked like a massive spider, but as Sarah's light hit it fully, she realized the truth was worse. The creature had a human torso grafted onto an arachnid's body, its face twisted in permanent anguish. It chittered at them, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "And this," Dr. Hartley continued, approaching the third container, "is where your husband made his greatest discovery." Sarah's heart stopped. The cage was empty except for scattered bones and what looked like torn clothing. A piece of fabric caught her eye, blue denim, the same shade as the shirt David had been wearing the night he disappeared. "You're lying," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew he wasn't. "David came to me 6 months ago," Dr. Hartley continued. He'd been researching the circus, following leads about the disappearances. He was convinced that something supernatural was involved, and he was right. but he was also reckless. Marcus stepped forward, his face grim. "What happened to him?" He wanted to study them up close. "I warned him about the feeding schedules, about their hunger, but he wouldn't listen. He thought his research would make him famous, that he could expose the truth about the midnight circus." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. All those nights David had claimed to be working late, all those mysterious phone calls and secretive meetings. He'd been here, in this house of horrors, communing with monsters. The irony, Dr. Hartley continued, is that he was partially right. The circus performers weren't born as monsters. They were transformed, changed by something the ringmaster found in Eastern Europe, something that could alter human flesh and bone. "The creature in my crate," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "It's the source, isn't it? The mother, yes. The others are her children, born from the performers she modified." He turned to face her fully. "And now she's awake again, thanks to you. She's been dormant for decades, but your touch, your contact with David's belongings in that storage unit, it awakened her maternal instincts." Sarah backed toward the door, pulling Marcus with her. "We're leaving, now." But Dr. Hartley stepped into their path. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, she's been calling to her children ever since you found her. They can hear her across any distance. And now they're hungry." As if summoned by his words, the creatures in the tanks began to stir. The contortionist pressed her face against the glass, her too many eyes fixed on Sarah. The spider thing chittered excitedly, its human face contorting with anticipation. And somewhere above them, Sarah heard the sound of splintering wood. The crate was breaking open. The basement of the Blackwood funeral home felt like descending into a tomb. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of metal cabinets and preparation tables that gleamed with an unsettling sterility. The smell of formaldehyde hung thick in the air, mixing with something else, something organic and wrong. Marcus stayed close behind her, his breathing shallow. "This is insane, Sarah. If Blackwood finds us down here—" "He won't." Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "He's at the town meeting with everyone else, remember? Besides, we need answers about David." They moved deeper into the basement, past the embalming stations and toward a door marked private storage. Sarah's heart hammered as she tested the handle. Locked, but the old brass mechanism looked flimsy. Marcus produced a credit card from his wallet and worked it against the lock until something clicked. The storage room beyond was smaller than expected, lined with filing cabinets and shelves of supplies. But it was the wall of photographs that made Sarah's breath catch. Dozens of black and white images, some dating back decades, all featuring the same traveling circus, the Midnight Carnival. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, studying the photos. "Look at the dates. This goes back to the 1940s. Sarah moved along the wall, her flashlight revealing image after image of performers, animals, and crowds. But it was the recurring presence of certain faces that chilled her, faces that appeared in photos decades apart, without aging a day. She recognized the woman with the dark eyes from the storage unit, captured in images from 1947, 1963, 1981, and finally 2019. "That's impossible," she breathed. A filing cabinet in the corner drew her attention. The top drawer was labeled Agreements, Current. Inside she found a folder thick with contracts, all bearing the letterhead of Blackwood Funeral Home and dated within the past 5 years. As she read, her hands began to shake. The documents were agreements between Harold Blackwood and something called the Midnight Collective. In exchange for disposal services and logistical support, Blackwood received substantial payments. But it was the nature of the services that made Sarah's blood run cold. The contracts detailed the provision of fresh subjects for what was euphemistically termed preservation research. "Marcus," she called, her voice barely a whisper. "You need to see this." He joined her, reading over her shoulder. "Preservation research? What the hell does that mean?" Sarah flipped through more documents, finding detailed logs of names, dates, and physical descriptions. Her finger stopped on a familiar entry dated 18 months ago. David Chen, male, 34 years old, 5 feet 10 inches, 180 pounds. Status, acquired. Condition, viable. The file slipped from her nerveless fingers. David hadn't died in an accident. He'd been taken, delivered to whatever nightmare the Midnight Collective represented. And Blackwood, respected pillar of the community Harold Blackwood, was their supplier. "We have to go," Marcus said urgently. "We have to go right now," and the lights flickered on, flooding the room with harsh fluorescence. Harold Blackwood stood in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something cold and calculating. In his hand was a small revolver, pointed steadily at Sarah's chest. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this," he said conversationally. "When you first came to town asking questions about David, I thought you'd eventually give up and leave. Most people do." Sarah's mind raced, looking for escape routes, but Blackwood blocked the only exit. "You killed him. You killed my husband." "Killed?" Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Oh, my dear, David isn't dead. Death would be a mercy compared to what he's become. The collective has very specific needs, you see. They require hosts, young, healthy individuals who can sustain their kind for decades." "You're insane," Marcus said, but his voice wavered. "Am I?" "The Midnight Collective has existed for over a century, moving from town to town, sustaining themselves through partnerships with people like me. In return for my services, they ensure that Millbrook remains prosperous, protected. A fair trade, I think." Sarah thought of the creature that had once been David, confined in that crate, transformed into something that was neither fully human nor entirely other. How many others? Over the years, perhaps 30 or 40. Young people passing through town, drifters, occasionally someone local who asked too many questions. The beauty of a small town is that people disappear all the time. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, simple departures for bigger cities. His smile was reptilian. "Your husband was supposed to be just another tragic accident. But something went wrong," Sarah realized. "That's why he was in the storage unit instead of with them." Blackwood's expression darkened. "The transformation process isn't always predictable. David proved resistant to their influence, requiring additional containment. They were preparing to transport him to their permanent facility when circumstances forced them to leave town temporarily. The storage unit was meant to be temporary. And now? Now they're returning to collect what belongs to them. Including you, I'm afraid. Fresh blood is always welcome." Behind her, Marcus shifted nervously. "Sarah, maybe we should wait. Get some backup or—" "No." Her voice came out sharper than intended. "David's in there. I can feel it." She'd been feeling it since they entered this underground chamber beneath the old Kellerman property. The pull in her chest had grown stronger with each step, like a compass needle finding true north. Whatever connection she'd shared with her husband in life hadn't been severed by death, or whatever state he existed in now. The key slid into the lock with a soft click that echoed through the cavern. Sarah hesitated, her hand trembling on the metal. 6 months of searching, of nightmares, of questions that ate away at her sanity, all leading to this moment. The lock turned. The lid creaked open on rusted hinges, releasing a smell that made Sarah gag. Not the sweet decay she'd grown accustomed to, but something worse, something alive and putrid. The interior was lined with yellowed silk that might have once been white, now stained with dark patches that could have been blood or something far more sinister. David lay curled inside, but calling it David felt like a cruel joke. The thing that had once been her husband was a patchwork of flesh and shadow, constantly shifting between forms. One moment she could see his familiar green eyes, the next they were replaced by holes that leaked black fluid. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if he were trying to speak but had forgotten how. "Oh God," Marcus whispered, "what did they do to him?" Sarah knelt beside the crate, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. Up close she could see the crude stitching that held parts of David together, arms that were too long, fingers that ended in points, skin that rippled like water. This wasn't resurrection. This was violation. David? She reached toward him, then stopped as his eyes, definitely his eyes now, focused on her with desperate clarity. His mouth moved, producing only a wet, rasping sound. But his hand, still recognizably his despite the grey pallor, lifted toward her. Sarah caught it, surprised by how cold his flesh felt, like touching marble in winter. The moment their skin connected, images flooded her mind. David, working late at the accounting firm. David, discovering discrepancies in the Kellerman estate finances. David, following a paper trail that led to this place. David, finding the circus crates in a warehouse, thinking he'd stumbled onto some elaborate tax fraud scheme. But the crates weren't hiding money. They were hiding something far older, far hungrier. Sarah saw through David's memory as figures in elaborate masks surrounded him. Not circus performers, something else entirely. The masks moved independently of the faces beneath them, grinning with too many teeth. She felt his terror as they dragged him down here, felt his confusion as they began the ritual that would transform him into one of their collection. "The traveling curiosities," Marcus said softly, reading from a placard mounted inside the crate's lid. "Acquired 1924. Subject exhibits remarkable regenerative properties following exposure to specimen 7. Maintains consciousness despite physical alterations. Perfect for extended study." David's grip tightened on Sarah's hand. She looked into his eyes and saw the man she'd married trapped inside this nightmare flesh, aware of every moment of his transformation, unable to scream. "We're getting you out of here," she whispered. But as she tried to help him sit up, David shook his head violently. His other hand pointed deeper into the chamber, where Sarah now noticed additional crates stacked in the shadows, dozens of them, and from several she could hear faint scratching sounds. "There are more," she breathed. David nodded, his eyes pleading, not just for himself but for all of them. However many victims the Kellerman family had collected over the decades, they were still here, still conscious, still suffering. A new sound echoed through the chamber, footsteps on the stairs they descended. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to leave, now." "I'm not leaving him again." Sarah looked around frantically, searching for another exit. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by voices she recognized from her nightmares. The collectors had returned. David squeezed her hand once more, then pushed her away with surprising strength. His meaning was clear: run. But Sarah had spent 6 months learning that running solved nothing. She pulled the brass key from the crate's lock and looked at the dozens of other containers waiting in the darkness. If they wanted their collection back, they'd have to fight for it. The basement of the old Blackwood mansion felt like descending into the earth's bowels. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through cobwebs thick as curtains, revealing stone walls that wept with decades of moisture. Behind her, Marcus's breathing was labored, his earlier bravado evaporating with each step downward. "The circus used this place as winter storage," he whispered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "After the fire in '73, they sealed everything down here." Sarah's beam found the first crate, identical to the ones from the storage unit, but larger, much larger. The wood was darker here, stained with something that might have been water damage but smelled metallic. Her stomach clenched as she recognized the same symbols carved into the surface. The twisted faces, the reaching hands, the serpentine creature that seemed to writhe in the shifting shadows. "How many are there?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His flashlight swept the vast space, revealing row upon row of crates stretching back into the darkness. 37, he finally said. "I counted them as a kid, back when I was stupid enough to come down here on dares." A sound echoed from somewhere deep in the basement, a wet sliding noise followed by what might have been breathing. Sarah's grip tightened on the flashlight. "We need to find David. If he's down here, he's been down here for 3 years, Marcus interrupted. Think about what that means." She didn't want to think about it. The thing in her storage unit had been dormant, preserved somehow in its wooden prison. But these crates were different. The wood was swollen, warped, Dark liquid seeped from between the boards of several containers, pooling on the stone floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sarah approached the nearest crate, her heart hammering against her ribs. The lid wasn't nailed shut like the others had been. Instead, it was held by a series of metal clasps, all of them open. She could see inside, darkness so complete it seemed solid. "Don't!" Marcus grabbed her arm. "Sarah, don't look!" But she had to. After 3 years of not knowing, of wondering if David had left her or met with some accident, she had to know. She pushed the lid open with the barrel of her flashlight. The smell hit her first, not decay, but something worse, something organic and alive and wrong. Her beam illuminated the interior of the crate, revealing a nest of what looked like wet fabric or membrane. It pulsed rhythmically, like breathing or a heartbeat. And there, partially dissolved into the organic mass, was a wedding ring, white gold with a small diamond chip, the same ring she'd placed on David's finger 8 years ago. "Oh God," she breathed, stepping back. The thing in the crate stirred at her voice, and she saw with horror that the membrane was transparent in places, revealing half-digested shapes beneath, human shapes. Marcus pulled her away from the crate, but his touch felt distant, unreal. "They feed slowly," he said, and his voice seemed to come from very far away. "The circus used to feed them volunteers at first, people who wanted to disappear, start new lives. But after a while, they just took whoever they could find." "You knew," Sarah said, the words falling out of her like blood from a wound. "All this time you knew what happened to him." "I suspected. When he came around asking about the circus history, about the storage units, I tried to warn him off, but he was obsessed. Said he'd found proof that Moreau's traveling show was connected to disappearances going back decades." The wet, sliding sound came again, closer now. Sarah's beam found movement in the far corner, something large undulating between the crates. As her light touched it, she saw it wasn't just one creature but several, their forms blended together into a writhing mass of flesh and fabric and bone. "We need to leave," Marcus said urgently. "They're more active at night." But Sarah couldn't move. She stared at the crates around her, understanding flooding through her like ice water. David hadn't left her. He hadn't been murdered by some random criminal. He'd found this place, just like she had, and he'd opened the wrong box. The creatures were moving now, emerging from their containers with sounds like wet cloth tearing. In the shifting beams of their flashlights, Sarah caught glimpses of faces within the writhing mass, some recent, some ancient, all frozen in expressions of terror and hunger. One face looked back at her with David's eyes. "Sarah!" Marcus was pulling her toward the stairs, but her legs wouldn't work. The thing that had been her husband was reaching toward her with appendages that might once have been arms, and she found herself reaching back. Then Marcus's hand cracked across her face, snapping her back to awareness just as the first creature's touch brushed her fingertips. The sensation was electric, invasive, hungry. They ran. The creature's scream echoed through the warehouse as Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The thing that had once been Marcus writhed against the chains, its elongated limbs stretching toward her with desperate hunger. But it was the recognition in those yellow eyes that truly terrified her. Somewhere in that twisted form, her husband was still aware. "Sarah," Detective Morrison's voice cut through her shock. "We need to move, now." She couldn't tear her gaze away from Marcus. His mouth opened and closed, producing sounds that might have been words if his vocal cords hadn't been so grotesquely altered. The transformation had been gradual, she realized. The missing persons reports, the pattern Morrison had shown her, they weren't random disappearances. They were stages of the same horrific process. "The journals," she whispered, her voice barely audible above Marcus's keening. "Dr. Beaumont's journals. They described the stages. First the dreams, then the physical changes, then they become what your husband became." Morrison grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Sarah, whatever you're thinking, whatever part of him you think is still in there, it's not enough to save him." But Sarah dug her heels in, resisting his pull. The antidote. Beaumont wrote about reversing the process. If we can find his laboratory. There is no laboratory, Morrison's patience snapped. I've been tracking this thing for months. Beaumont's been dead for 70 years. Whatever he started, whatever experiments he conducted, died with him. Marcus's chains rattled violently, and one of the bolts securing him to the wall began to work loose. A fine shower of concrete dust rained down as he threw his weight against his restraints with inhuman strength. He's getting stronger, Morrison observed grimly, drawing his weapon. The transformation accelerates once they've fed enough. Fed? Sarah's stomach lurched. Fed on what? Morrison's expression was grim. You don't want to know. But even as he said it, Sarah's mind was already connecting the dots. The missing persons reports Morrison had shown her weren't just victims of the same process. They were food for those who had already transformed. Marcus hadn't been disappearing for weeks because he was changing. He'd been disappearing to hunt. The realization hit her like a physical blow. All those nights he'd claimed to be working late. All those business trips that had seemed so sudden and urgent. How many people had died while she'd been home, worried sick about him, never suspecting the truth. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store, she said, the words tumbling out. She went missing 2 months ago. And that college student, the one whose car they found by the river. Morrison nodded grimly. 12 victims that we know of, probably more. Another bolt gave way with a sharp crack. Marcus's movements became more frenzied, his elongated fingers clawing at the air between them. The sound he made now was definitely attempting to form words. Sarah, Sarah. Her name, distorted but unmistakable, emerging from that ruined throat. Despite everything Morrison had told her, despite the evidence of Marcus's monstrous acts, her heart twisted at the sound. He remembers me, she said. Predators remember their prey, Morrison replied harshly. It doesn't make them human. But there was something else in Marcus's eyes now, something beyond hunger. As Sarah watched, tears began to leak from the corners of those yellow orbs, cutting pale tracks through the grime on his distorted features. He's suffering, she realized. God, he knows what he's become. A third bolt snapped. Marcus lunged forward, his chains bringing him up short just inches from where Sarah stood. This close, she could see the fine scales that had begun to replace his skin, could smell the fetid sweetness of decay that clung to him, but she could also see the anguish in his transformed features, the desperate intelligence trapped inside a monster's body. The music box, she said suddenly, remembering something from Dr. Beaumont's notes. It wasn't just a trigger, it was a control mechanism. The specific frequency, the melody, it could induce behavioral changes in the subjects. Morrison was already shaking his head. Even if that's true, we destroyed it. It's nothing but twisted metal now. But the frequency, if we could reproduce it somehow. The remaining chains snapped all at once. Marcus hit the ground in a crouch, his powerful legs coiling beneath him like springs. For one frozen moment, predator and prey faced each other across the small space. Then Marcus leaped. Morrison's gun barked twice, the shots echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space. Sarah saw Marcus jerk in midair, dark blood spraying from his shoulder and chest. But the wounds barely slowed him down. He crashed into Morrison, sending them both tumbling to the concrete floor. Sarah ran for the door, Morrison's agonized scream following her into the night. Behind her, the sounds of the struggle grew increasingly desperate, then suddenly terrifyingly quiet. The basement beneath Marcus's antique shop felt like descending into the belly of some ancient beast. Each step down the wooden stairs released the scent of sawdust and something else, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. The air grew thicker, warmer, and she could hear movement in the darkness ahead. Detective Rivera's flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a workshop that stretched far deeper than the building's footprint should have allowed. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools that belonged in a museum of torture rather than restoration. But it was the center of the room, that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. 3 massive cages dominated the space, their ornate brass bars gleaming in the artificial light. They were identical to the ones from the storage unit, but these weren't empty. Inside the nearest cage, something pressed against the bars, pale, elongated fingers that bent at impossible angles. "Jesus Christ," Rivera whispered, raising her weapon. The creature in the cage turned toward them, and Sarah saw her husband's eyes staring back at her. But everything else was wrong. David's face had been stretched and distorted, his jaw extended to accommodate rows of needle-sharp teeth. His limbs had grown grotesquely long, and when he moved, his joints popped and cracked like breaking branches. "Sarah," the thing that had been David whispered, his voice a wet, rattling sound. "You found me." Sarah stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The rational part of her mind wanted to deny what she was seeing, to find some logical explanation. But deep down, she'd known. Ever since she'd opened that first crate, some part of her had understood that David hadn't simply disappeared. "The transformation takes time," Marcus said from behind them. Neither Sarah nor Rivera had heard him descend the stairs. "David fought it longer than most. His love for you, I suppose. But biology always wins in the end." Rivera spun around, her gun trained on the antique dealer. "Don't move. You're under arrest for kidnapping, murder and—" "Murder?" Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the basement walls. "Detective, these creatures are very much alive. More alive than they ever were as ordinary humans. I've given them a gift." The cages began to rattle as their occupants pressed against the bars. Sarah could see 2 other figures in the shadows, both partially transformed, their bodies caught between human and something else entirely. One still wore the tattered remains of a circus costume. "You're insane," Rivera said, but her voice wavered. The evidence of impossibility surrounded them, challenging everything she thought she knew about the world. Marcus stepped closer, seemingly unconcerned about the weapon pointed at him. The Cirque du Cauchemar understood what others couldn't. Human evolution doesn't have to be left to chance. With the right catalyst, the right conditions, we can guide it ourselves. Sarah found her voice. "The creature in my garage. Specimen 23. Still in the early stages when you found him. The circus was shut down before his transformation could complete." Marcus gestured toward the cages. "But here, in controlled conditions, I've been able to perfect the process." The David thing pressed its face against the bars, and Sarah could see recognition flickering in those familiar eyes. "Help me," it pleaded, though the words were barely intelligible through its malformed mouth. "You did this to him," Sarah said, rage building in her chest. "You took him and turned him into this." "He volunteered," Marcus said simply. "When I explained what I was working toward, he was fascinated. Your husband was always drawn to the extraordinary, Sarah. That's why he bought that storage unit in the first place. He knew exactly what was inside." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. He knew. "The original owner of the circus was my grandfather. When he died and left behind his research, I knew I had to continue his work. David helped me track down the remaining specimens, the equipment, the formulas. He was my partner until he decided he wanted to experience the transformation firsthand." Rivera's radio crackled with static, but the voices were unintelligible in the basement's strange atmosphere. "Backup should be here any minute," she said, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as them. Marcus smiled. "I'm afraid your communication devices won't function properly down here. The electromagnetic field generated by the specimens interferes with most electronics. We're quite isolated." The creature that had been David began to keen, a low, mournful sound that was answered by the other 2 cages. The harmonics made Sarah's bones ache and her vision blur around the edges. "The process is irreversible," Marcus continued conversationally. "But they're not suffering. If anything, they're experiencing existence on a level we can't comprehend. Enhanced senses, increased strength, freedom from the limitations of human form." Sarah stared at the thing that wore her husband's eyes and felt something break inside her chest. The basement reeked of old blood and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Sarah's stomach turn. Marcus had led her down here at gunpoint, past rows of rusted equipment and into what looked like an operating theater from a nightmare. Surgical tables lined the walls, their leather restraints dark with stains. Glass containers filled with floating specimens caught the harsh fluorescent light, casting grotesque shadows across the concrete floor. "You really thought you could just walk away?" Marcus asked, keeping the gun trained on her as he moved to a cabinet filled with instruments. "After everything you've seen?" Sarah's mind raced, searching for an escape route, but the basement had only one exit, the stairs behind Marcus. The creature from the storage unit cowered in the corner, its form shifting between human and something else entirely. In the harsh light, she could see more clearly what it had become. The skin was translucent in places, revealing organs that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. Its eyes, once brown like Tom's, now held flecks of gold that seemed to move on their own. "What did you do to him?" she whispered. Marcus smiled, selecting a syringe from the cabinet. "We perfected him. Tom volunteered, you know. He was so eager to help advance our research." He turned back to her, the needle gleaming. "The transformation process isn't complete. It takes months of careful cultivation. Your husband was our greatest success story." The creature let out a low moan, and Sarah saw recognition flicker in those alien eyes. It was trying to speak, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She took a step toward it, ignoring Marcus's warning gesture with the gun. "Tom, can you understand me?" The thing that had been her husband nodded slowly, painfully. When it finally managed to speak, the voice was like gravel scraping against glass. "Sarah, run." "Touching," Marcus said. "But he's not your husband anymore. He belongs to us now, to the circus. We've been perfecting this process for over a century, creating the perfect performers. People pay good money to see the impossible made flesh." Sarah's blood ran cold as the full scope of their operation became clear. The missing persons reports, all those people who disappeared near the circus routes. "Raw material," Marcus confirmed. "Though most weren't suitable, Tom was special. His physiology adapted beautifully to the serum." He gestured to other containers around the room, and Sarah realized with horror that some contained human remains in various stages of transformation. The others, well, not every experiment succeeds. The creature, Tom, struggled to its feet, swaying unsteadily. Its form rippled, bones shifting beneath that translucent skin. "Sarah," it managed again, clearer this time. The reversal, in the green cabinet." Marcus spun around, following Tom's gaze. "Shut up!" He fired a shot, but Tom moved with inhuman speed, the bullets sparking off the concrete wall. Sarah didn't hesitate. She lunged for the green cabinet Tom had indicated, yanking it open as Marcus tried to get another clear shot. Inside were vials of clear liquid and detailed notes in Tom's handwriting. Her husband had been working on reversing the process, documenting everything. "He was trying to save the others," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "That's why you killed him. He was going to expose you." "Tom chose to betray us," Marcus snarled. "After everything we gave him, enhanced strength, accelerated healing, virtual immortality, he threw it all away for sentiment." Tom let out a roar that shook the entire basement, his form expanding as rage triggered another transformation. Sarah grabbed several vials and the research notes, stuffing them into her jacket as Marcus fired wildly at the moving target Tom had become. "The journal," Tom's voice echoed strangely now, coming from everywhere at once. "Sarah, my journal, upstairs." She understood. Tom had left her breadcrumbs, hidden documentation of everything he'd discovered, evidence that could bring down the entire organization. The lights flickered as Tom's body began to emit a strange phosphorescent glow. Whatever the serum had done to him, it was accelerating now, his emotions triggering rapid changes. Marcus backed toward the stairs, suddenly realizing he'd lost control of the situation. Sarah saw her chance. As Marcus turned to run, She tackled him from behind, sending them both tumbling. The gun skittered across the floor, disappearing under one of the surgical tables. Marcus scrambled after it, but Tom was faster, his elongated arm stretching impossible distances to pin the man against the wall. "The police," Sarah gasped, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." "They won't believe you," Marcus wheezed, Tom's grip tightening around his throat. "We have connections everywhere. This goes deeper than you can imagine." Tom's face appeared inches from Marcus's, his features constantly shifting between human and something otherworldly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of months of suffering. "Then we'll make them believe." The basement fell silent except for Marcus's labored breathing and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. Sarah clutched the vials tighter, knowing they held the key to everything. The truth about Tom's disappearance, the circus's horrific experiments, and possibly the salvation of everyone they'd transformed. She looked at her husband, barely recognizable now but still fighting to protect her, and made a decision that would change everything. The creature's massive form filled the warehouse doorway, its pale flesh rippling with each labored breath. Sarah pressed herself against Marcus's side, feeling his body trembling as violently as her own. The thing that had once been David tilted its grotesquely enlarged head, and she caught a glimpse of something achingly familiar in those black, sunken eyes, a flicker of recognition that made her stomach lurch. "David," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. The creature's head snapped toward her voice, and its mouth opened in what might have been an attempt at her name, but only a wet, rasping sound emerged. Behind it, she could hear the shuffle of other forms moving in the darkness beyond the warehouse. "There are more of them," Marcus breathed, his grip tightening on the crowbar he'd grabbed from the floor. "Sarah, we need to move. Now." But she couldn't tear her gaze away from the thing that had been her husband. Even transformed into this nightmare, she could see traces of the man she'd loved. The way it held its left shoulder slightly higher than the right, just like David had after his old football injury. The familiar tilt of its head when it was confused. "The serum," she said suddenly, remembering the partially filled vial they'd found among Dr. Meridian's papers. "Marcus, the reversal serum, where is it?" "It's theoretical at best," he replied, his eyes never leaving the creature. "And even if it worked, look at him, Sarah. Look at what's left." The thing that was David took a step forward, its bare feet making wet sounds against the concrete. Its movements were becoming more agitated, and she could see thick veins pulsing beneath its translucent skin. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the shadows, other victims of the circus's experiments, other people who had vanished over the years. "The fire," she said, spotting the emergency flare Marcus had dropped earlier. "If we can't save them, we can end this. Sarah, they're suffering." Her voice broke as she watched David struggle to form words, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "They're trapped in there, Marcus. They know what they've become." A sound from outside made them both freeze, car engines growing closer. Through the grimy windows, Sarah could see headlights cutting through the darkness. "The police," Marcus said. "Someone must have called it in." The creatures heard it too. David's head swiveled toward the windows, and a low, keening sound rose from his throat. The others behind him began to move with increasing agitation, their pale forms pressing against each other in the doorway. "They're afraid," Sarah realized. "They know what will happen if they're found." She moved toward the flare, but David stepped into her path. Up close, the smell was overwhelming, a mixture of chemicals and decay that made her eyes water. His transformed features were a grotesque parody of the face she'd once kissed goodnight. But when their eyes met, she saw a moment of clarity there. "David," she whispered again. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." The creature's hand, if it could still be called that, reached out toward her face. The fingers were elongated and pale, ending in what looked like exposed bone, but the gesture was achingly gentle. For just an instant she felt the ghost of the man who used to cup her cheek when she cried. The police sirens were closer now, and she could hear shouting from outside. The other creatures were becoming more frantic, their movements increasingly violent as they sensed the approaching threat. "We have to go," Marcus urged, grabbing her arm. "Sarah, we have to go now." But she shook him off, reaching for the flare. "Help me with this. Help me end their suffering." David seemed to understand what she intended. Instead of stopping her, he stepped back, his black eyes fixed on hers. In that gaze, she saw gratitude and permission. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before moving to help her. Together, they began overturning containers of the chemical compounds they'd found, creating a trail toward the exit. The acrid smell of the spilled chemicals mixed with the creature's stench, making the air nearly unbreathable. "The building will go up fast," Marcus warned, striking the flare to life. The red light cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the creatures look even more nightmarish. Sarah took one last look at her husband. "Goodbye, David." She tossed the flare into the pool of chemicals and ran, Marcus beside her, as flames erupted behind them. The creature's keening grew louder, but underneath it, she thought she heard something that might have been relief. They burst through the side exit just as the first police car rounded the corner, the warehouse already becoming an inferno behind them. In the distance, sirens wailed, but Sarah knew it was too late for rescue. It was exactly what she'd intended. The creature's eyes locked onto Sarah's, and in that moment she saw something that made her blood freeze: recognition. Not the mindless hunger she'd witnessed before, but a flicker of the man she'd once loved buried deep within that grotesque form. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the creature's labored breathing. The thing that had been her husband tilted its elongated head, mandibles clicking softly. For a heartbeat, the aggressive posture softened, and Sarah saw pain flicker across its inhuman features. But then Detective Morrison's radio crackled to life, shattering the fragile moment. "All units, we have reports of multiple creatures in the downtown area. Repeat, multiple creatures." The sound triggered something primal in David's transformed state. His head snapped toward Morrison, mandibles spreading wide as that bone-chilling shriek erupted from his throat. Sarah realized with horror that whatever humanity remained was losing the battle against the circus master's twisted creation. "The antidote," she gasped, remembering the vial she'd found in Maddox's private collection. She'd tucked it into her jacket pocket hours ago, hoping against hope that it might be some kind of reversal serum. Her fingers closed around the small glass cylinder as David's attention returned to her. "David, I know you're in there," she said, slowly pulling out the vial. "I know what Maddox did to you. The experiments, the transformation. None of it was your choice." The creature's breathing became more erratic, and Sarah noticed something she'd missed before. David's left arm, the one that had been broken in 3 places during his motorcycle accident years ago, hung differently than the right. Even in this monstrous form, his body remembered its injuries. Morrison raised his weapon, but Sarah held up her hand. "Don't. Please, give me a chance." "Sarah, that thing isn't your husband anymore," Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, he is." She took a step closer to David, holding the vial where he could see it. "I found Maddox's journal. I know about the Circus families, about the genetic modifications, but I also know he was working on a way to reverse the process." David's mandibles clicked rapidly, and for a moment his form seemed to waver, as if he was fighting against his altered biology. Sarah saw her opening and moved closer, close enough to smell the sickly sweet scent of his transformed flesh. "Remember our wedding day?" she said softly. "You insisted on that ridiculous magic trick during the reception. You made my grandmother's ring disappear and couldn't get it back for 20 minutes. I was furious, but you just laughed and said the best magic was worth a little chaos." Something shifted in David's eyes. The predatory gleam faded, replaced by confusion and what looked like grief. He made a sound, not a shriek this time, but something almost human. Sarah's heart clenched as she recognized the vocal pattern. He was trying to say her name. With trembling hands, she uncapped the vial. The liquid inside was opalescent, shifting between blue and silver like mercury. "I don't know if this will work," she admitted, "but I have to try." David's transformed body shuddered, and she realized he was nodding, actually nodding. Whatever part of him remained human understood and was consenting to this final gamble. Sarah raised the vial to his mandibles, and David opened them willingly. The antidote poured across his altered tongue, and for several seconds, nothing happened. Then David's entire body convulsed, a sound like screaming metal filling the air as his bones began to shift and crack. Morrison stepped forward, weapon ready, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait," she pleaded. David collapsed to his knees, his exoskeleton beginning to split along hairline fractures. Underneath, Sarah caught glimpses of pale human skin. The transformation was agony. She could see it in every spasm that racked his changing form. But gradually, impossibly, her husband began to emerge from the nightmare Maddox had made him. It took nearly 10 minutes. When the convulsions finally stopped, David lay curled on the warehouse floor, naked and shivering but undeniably human. Sarah knelt beside him, carefully checking his pulse. It was weak but steady. "Sarah?" David's voice was hoarse, confused. What happened to me?" She pulled off her jacket and wrapped it around him, tears streaming down her face. "You disappeared," she said simply. "But you're back now. You're back." As sirens wailed in the distance and Morrison called for medical assistance, Sarah held her husband close and tried not to think about the other creatures still loose in the city. For this moment, in this warehouse full of broken dreams and twisted ambitions, she had what she'd been searching for all along. The nightmare was over, but the questions about Maddox's other victims, about the Circus families, about whether the antidote could save them all, those would have to wait. Right now, David was alive, human, and home.